Hey there, how's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. I want to start with a question that might sound a bit strange at first. What if I told you there's a single place on Earth that produces 20% of our planet's oxygen, controls the weather for an entire continent, and holds more biological treasure than anywhere else on the planet? What if I told you this same place is also the key to preventing complete climate collapse, feeds billions of people, and contains cures for diseases we haven't even discovered yet? You'd probably think I was talking about some mythical land from a fantasy novel, right? Well, here's the thing. This place is absolutely real. And right now, as we're talking, it's disappearing faster than ever before in human history. Welcome to the Amazon Rainforest. OS, 6.5 million square kilometers of the most incredible wilderness our planet has ever created. And here's what's going to blow your mind. Most of us have no idea what we're actually looking at when we think about the Amazon. Picture this. You're flying over the rainforest in a small plane, looking down at what seems like an endless green carpet stretching to every horizon. It looks peaceful, almost boring from up there. Just trees, right? But you're actually flying over the most complex, most sophisticated system on Earth. You're looking at a living machine that took 55 million years to perfect, and it's working so hard right now that it's literally creating the weather you'll experience thousands of miles away. Let me put this in perspective for you. That green canopy below, it contains more species of life than every other habitat on Earth combined. We're talking about 10% of all known species living in just 6% of the Earth's land surface. But here's the crazy part. Scientists estimate we've only discovered about 10% of what's actually down there. Think about that for a second. 90% of the Amazon species are still completely unknown to science. Every single day, researchers are finding new species of plants, animals, insects, and fungi. Not just tiny microorganisms either. We're talking about new species of monkeys, new types of poisonous frogs, trees that have been growing for centuries that science has never classified. Just last year, scientists discovered 26 new species in a single expedition. 26! In one trip. But the numbers get even more staggering when you really dive into them. The Amazon contains approximately 390 billion trees. Let me say that again. 390 billion individual trees. If you could count one tree every second, it would take you over 12,000 years to count them all. And each one of these trees is a sophisticated biological factory, working 24 hours a day to keep our planet habitable. Now, I know what you're thinking. Trees are trees, right? How different can they really be? Well, here's where it gets fascinating. A single tree in the Amazon, just one tree, can be home to more species than exist in entire countries. Scientists have found over 300 species of insects living on a single tree. That's more biodiversity in one tree than you'll find in all of Great Britain. But let's zoom out for a moment and talk about what the Amazon actually does for our planet, because this is where things get really mind-blowing. First, let's talk about oxygen. You've probably heard that the Amazon produces 20% of the world's oxygen, and that's true. But here's what most people don't understand. It's not just producing oxygen, it's regulating the entire atmospheric composition of our planet. Those 390 billion trees are constantly inhaling carbon dioxide and exhaling oxygen, but they're doing it on such a massive scale that they're literally controlling the greenhouse gas levels that determine whether our planet is habitable or not. Think of it this way. If Earth had lungs, the Amazon would be them. Every day, the Amazon inhales about 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide. That's roughly equivalent to the emissions from every car in America for an entire year. Every single day. And it's been doing this for millions of years, quietly keeping our atmosphere balanced while we went about our lives completely unaware of this invisible service. But here's where it gets really wild. The Amazon doesn't just clean our air, It creates our weather. You know those massive storm systems that bring rain to Brazil, Argentina, and even parts of North America? The Amazon makes those. It's literally a weather factory. Here's how it works, and this is going to sound like science fiction. The Amazon trees are constantly releasing water vapor into the atmosphere through their leaves. A single large tree releases about 1,000 liters of water every day. One tree. Now multiply that by 390 billion trees, and you start to understand the scale we're talking about. All that water vapor rises into the atmosphere and forms massive rivers of moisture flowing through the sky. Scientists call them flying rivers, and they carry more water than the Amazon River itself, about 200 billion tons of moisture per year, floating invisible above our heads. These aerial waterways travel thousands of kilometers, bringing rain to Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, and cities as far away as the American Midwest. You're probably wondering how something happening in the Amazon could possibly affect rainfall in Iowa or Argentina. Well, imagine the Amazon as a massive pump, constantly sending moisture into the global circulation system. When that moisture hits different atmospheric conditions, it falls as rain thousands of miles away. The spring rains that water the cornfields of the American Midwest, they partly come from moisture that evaporated from Amazon trees weeks earlier. But it gets even more incredible when you realize that the Amazon actually creates its own climate. The forest makes its own rain through this constant cycle of evaporation and precipitation. About half of the rainfall in the Amazon basin comes from moisture recycled by the forest itself. The trees create the rain that keeps them alive, which creates more trees, which create more rain. It's a perfect system that's been running for millions of years. Now, let's talk about the biological treasure chest that is the Amazon, because this is where you really start to understand what we could lose. 25% of all Western pharmaceuticals come from rainforest plants. 25%. That means 1 out of every 4 medicines in your medicine cabinet originated from something growing in the rainforest. We're talking about treatments for heart disease, cancer, diabetes, depression, and thousands of other conditions. But here's the kicker. We've only tested about 1% of Amazon plants for their medicinal properties. 1%. That means there are potentially thousands of cures for diseases growing in the Amazon right now, waiting to be discovered. That breakthrough cancer treatment that could save your loved one's life 20 years from now, it might be sitting in a flower that blooms for just a few days each year in some remote corner of the rainforest. The indigenous peoples of the Amazon have been using these plants as medicine for thousands of years. They've developed an incredible pharmacological knowledge that took generations to accumulate. Some tribes can identify over 3,000 medicinal plants and know exactly how to prepare and combine them for different treatments. This knowledge is passed down through oral tradition, and when these communities disappear, that knowledge disappears forever. Think about this. Aspirin came from willow bark. Digitalis, which treats Apret's heart conditions, came from foxglove plants. Quinine, which fights malaria, came from the bark of a South American tree. Many of our most important medicines started as folk remedies that indigenous peoples had been using for centuries before science caught up. But the Amazon isn't just a medicine chest, it's also a food treasury. The genetic diversity of crops in the Amazon is staggering. Wild varieties of rice, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and dozens of other staple foods grow naturally in the rainforest. These wild varieties contain genetic traits that could be crucial for feeding humanity as our climate changes. When crops face new diseases or changing weather patterns, scientists turn to these wild varieties to find genes for resistance or adaptation. It's like having a genetic backup drive for all the food crops that civilization depends on. Lose the Amazon, and we lose that insurance policy against agricultural disaster. Let me give you a specific example that shows how connected we all are to this rainforest. Brazil nuts, ACA, those large triangular nuts you might find in a mixed nut container, can only be reproduced in the wild Amazon. Scientists have tried growing Brazil nut trees in plantations, but they won't produce nuts. Why? Because Brazil nut trees depend on a specific species of orchid bee for pollination, and those bees depend on a specific type of orchid for part of their life cycle, and that orchid depends on the specific ecosystem conditions that only exist in undisturbed rainforest. It's a chain of dependence so complex that we're still figuring it out. Remove any link in that chain, and the whole system collapses. This is happening throughout the Amazon. Intricate relationships between species that took millions of years to evolve and can be destroyed in an afternoon with a chainsaw. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Amazon is something you can't see at all: the fungal networks that connect the entire forest. Scientists have discovered that the trees in the Amazon are connected by vast underground networks of fungi that act like a forest-wide internet. These networks, called mycorrhizal networks, allow trees to share nutrients, water, and even information. When a tree is attacked by insects, it can send chemical signals through these fungal networks to warn other trees, which then start producing defensive compounds before the insects reach them. Old, established trees use these networks to nurture younger trees, sharing resources to help them grow. It's like the forest has its own social media system, and it's been running for millions of years. Here's what really gets me excited about this. The Amazon isn't just a collection of individual trees competing for resources. It's a single, integrated superorganism where every part supports every other part. The trees, the fungi, the insects, the birds, the mammals, they're all connected in ways we're just beginning to understand. Scientists studying these networks have found that cutting down even small sections of forest can disrupt these underground connections across vast areas. It's like cutting fiber optic cables. The damage spreads far beyond the immediate area of destruction. And here's something that will blow your mind. Some of these fungal networks are older than human civilization. There are individual fungal organisms in the Amazon that have been alive for thousands of years, connecting generation after generation of trees in an unbroken chain of life that stretches back to before the pyramids were built. So, when we talk about saving the Amazon, we're not just talking about saving trees. We're talking about preserving the most sophisticated biological system our planet has ever created. We're talking about protecting the lungs of the Earth, the pharmacy of the future, the weather maker for entire continents, and a living library of evolutionary knowledge that took 55 million years to write. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. This incredible system, this biological masterpiece that our planet spent tens of millions of years creating, could disappear in our lifetime. Not in some distant future, not in our children's lifetime. Our lifetime. The Amazon is disappearing faster now than at any point in human history. Every minute, we lose an area of Amazon rainforest the size of 2 football fields. Every single minute. While you've been listening to this chapter, dozens of acres of irreplaceable rainforest have vanished forever. And here's the terrifying part. Once we lose the Amazon, it's gone forever. This isn't like other environmental problems where we can clean up the damage later. The Amazon took 55 million years to evolve into what it is today. Once it's gone, all that complexity, all that interconnectedness, all those species and relationships and underground networks, they can never be recreated. We would be like primitive humans trying to rebuild a supercomputer with stone tools. The question that haunts scientists studying the Amazon is this: how much can we lose before the whole system collapses? Because here's what they've discovered. The Amazon doesn't die gradually. It reaches a tipping point where the remaining forest can't generate enough rain to sustain itself, and then the entire system crashes all at once. We're racing toward that tipping point right now. Some scientists think we might have already passed it in parts of the southern Amazon, and once we cross that line, there's no going back. The Amazon becomes a grassland, the flying rivers stop flowing, the carbon storage ends, and the greatest biological treasure our planet has ever created becomes a memory. But here's why I wanted to start our journey together by showing you what we're really talking about. Because once you understand what the Amazon actually is, not just a bunch of trees, but the life support system for our planet, then you understand why losing it would be the greatest catastrophe in human history. And that's where our story really begins, because the Amazon's fate isn't sealed. The choices we make right now, in the next few years, will determine whether this incredible system survives or becomes the largest environmental disaster our species has ever witnessed. So, stick with me as we dive deeper into this story. We're going to explore what losing the Amazon would actually mean for every person on Earth, how close we are to that nightmare scenario, and most importantly, what we can still do to prevent it. Because this isn't just a story about trees. This is a story about us, and the choice we're making right now about what kind of planet we want to leave behind. Now, I want you to imagine waking up tomorrow morning to breaking news that will change everything. The headline reads, Amazon rainforest dies. Overnight, global climate emergency declared. It sounds impossible, right? Like something from a disaster movie. But here's what keeps climate scientists awake at night. This scenario isn't science fiction. It's a mathematical certainty if we lose just 8% more of the Amazon. Let me walk you through what the end of the world actually looks like, because it doesn't happen with explosions or dramatic music. It happens quietly, gradually, and then all at once, like a massive machine slowly grinding to a halt until the gears finally seize up completely. The Amazon's death wouldn't announce itself with fanfare. One year, the rains would come a little later than usual. Scientists would notice the forest was releasing slightly less moisture into the atmosphere. The flying rivers we talked about, those invisible streams of water vapor that feed half a continent, would start to weaken. At first, it would look like a normal drought year. Farmers would complain about delayed rains, but they'd adapt. They always have. But here's the terrifying thing about tipping points. They look manageable, right? Up until they're not. Picture the Amazon like a massive dam holding back catastrophe. Every tree that falls, every acre that burns, every road that cuts through the forest adds another crack to that dam. For decades, maybe even centuries, the dam holds. The cracks spread slowly, almost imperceptibly. Scientists issue warnings, but life goes on. People adapt. The system bends, but doesn't break. Until one day, it does. The collapse wouldn't start in the heart of the Amazon. It would begin at the edges, in the places already stressed by human activity. The southern Amazon, where cattle ranches have already cleared millions of acres, would go first. The remaining forest patches, isolated and struggling, would start to die back faster than they could regenerate. And then the feedback loops would kick in, those terrifying cycles that turn manageable problems into unstoppable disasters. Here's how it works. Damaged forest burns easier during dry seasons. Burned areas create more heat, which creates longer droughts. Longer droughts stress the remaining trees, making them more vulnerable to fire. More fires mean less forest to produce rain. Less rain means longer droughts. More drought means more fires. Around and around it goes, each cycle worse than the last. Within 5 years of the tipping point, vast areas of the Amazon would transform from lush rainforest to dry savanna. The trees that took decades to grow would disappear in a single fire season. The underground fungal networks that connected the forest would die, severing the communication links that kept the ecosystem healthy. Species that took millions of years to evolve would vanish in months. But the real catastrophe would be invisible to anyone standing in the forest. It would be happening in the atmosphere, as the Amazon's death sends shockwaves through the global climate system. Those flying rivers, remember them? 200 billion tons of moisture flowing through the sky every year. When the Amazon dies, they stop flowing. Immediately. It's like someone turns off a tap that's been running for millions of years. The first places to feel it would be South American cities. São Paulo, home to 22 million people, depends entirely on Amazon moisture for its water supply. Without the forest pumping water vapor into the atmosphere, the city would face the worst drought in human history within months. But São Paulo is just the beginning. Buenos Aires, Montevideo, Asunción, every major city in southern South America relies on rain that starts as evaporation from Amazon trees. When that moisture disappears, the entire region plunges into drought. We're not talking about water restrictions or brown lawns. We're talking about cities running completely dry. But here's where it gets truly scary. The Amazon's influence reaches far beyond South America. That moisture eventually makes its way north, contributing to rainfall patterns across the entire Western Hemisphere. The spring rains that water the American Midwest? Gone. The weather systems that bring moisture to Mexico and Central America? Disrupted beyond recognition. Agricultural collapse would happen faster than anyone imagined possible. Brazil produces 1/3 of the world's soybeans, and soy needs very specific rainfall patterns to grow. Without Amazon moisture, Brazilian soy production would collapse within 2 growing seasons. Argentina, the world's 3rd largest soy exporter, would follow immediately after. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so soy prices go up, people eat less tofu, how bad can it be? But here's what most people don't realize. Soy isn't just food for humans. It's the primary protein source for livestock around the world. When soy disappears, meat production collapses globally. China imports 60% of its soybeans from Brazil and Argentina. When that supply vanishes, China faces an immediate protein crisis. The country that feeds 1/5 of humanity suddenly can't feed its pigs, chickens, or cattle. Meat becomes a luxury item overnight. Food riots begin in cities across China as prices explode. But it doesn't stop there. The global food system is so interconnected that a shock in one region spreads everywhere instantly. When Brazilian and Argentine crops fail, importing countries scramble to find alternative sources. Food prices don't just rise, they explode. The food crisis of 2008, which toppled governments and triggered riots across the developing world, would look like a minor inconvenience compared to this. Coffee production would end almost immediately. Brazil produces about 40% of the world's coffee, and coffee plants are incredibly sensitive to rainfall patterns. Without Amazon moisture, the coffee regions of Brazil would become too dry to support cultivation. Your morning cup of coffee, it would become as expensive as fine wine within a year. And here's something that would shock the global economy. Death. The Amazon's death would trigger the collapse of Atlantic hurricane patterns. The forest's cooling effect helps regulate the temperature difference between the Atlantic Ocean and the South American continent. Remove that cooling, and hurricane seasons would become monsters. Imagine hurricanes twice as powerful as anything we've seen, forming earlier and lasting longer. Coastal cities from Miami to New York would face annual devastation. The economic cost would be measured in trillions of dollars annually, just from storm damage alone. But perhaps the cruelest irony would be what happens to the Amazon region itself. 30 million people live in the Amazon basin, indigenous communities, river dwellers, city residents who've built their lives around the forest. When their home becomes the world's largest desert, where do they go? The migration would be unprecedented. Think about the Syrian refugee crisis, which displaced about 6 million people and strained the resources of neighboring countries to the breaking point. Now imagine 50 times that number, 300 million climate refugees fleeing a dead Amazon, all needing food, water, shelter, and hope. Brazilian cities like São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, already struggling with 20+ million residents each, would face an influx of climate refugees that would make every existing urban challenge look trivial. We're talking about the breakdown of basic services, hospitals overwhelmed, schools overflowing, sanitation systems collapsing under the weight of desperate populations. But the refugees wouldn't stop at Brazil's borders. When an area the size of Australia becomes uninhabitable almost overnight, the displacement spreads across continents. South American governments would face impossible choices, I mean accept millions of refugees and risk their own collapse, or militarize their borders and watch humanitarian catastrophe unfold. The geopolitical implications would reshape the world order. Countries that depend on Amazon moisture for agriculture would face internal food riots and government collapse. The delicate balance of international trade would shatter as traditional food exporters become importers overnight. Resource wars would erupt as nations fight over the remaining arable land. And then there's the carbon bomb that would make all other climate change look gradual by comparison. The Amazon stores between 150 and 200 billion tons of carbon in its trees, soil, and vegetation. That's more carbon than humanity has emitted from burning fossil fuels in the entire industrial era. When the forest dies, through fire, decay, or conversion to grassland, all that carbon gets released into the atmosphere within decades. To put this in perspective, current atmospheric carbon dioxide levels are around 420 parts per million. The death of the Amazon would add another 50 parts per million, almost instantly, the same increase that took us 70 years of industrial activity to produce. Global temperatures wouldn't just rise gradually over decades, they would spike by several degrees within a few years. The careful climate targets that nations have spent decades negotiating would become impossible overnight. We'd be looking at a world 4 or 5 degrees warmer than today, a planet that would be barely recognizable. Ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica would accelerate their collapse. Sea levels would rise not in millimeters per year, but in meters per decade. Coastal cities that house billions of people would face the choice between building massive seawalls or abandoning their homes to the rising ocean. Weather patterns that have been stable for thousands of years would become chaotic. The monsoons that water crops feeding 3 billion people in Asia would shift unpredictably. Droughts would strike regions that have never experienced water shortage. Floods would devastate areas that haven't seen major flooding in recorded history. But here's what really keeps me up at night. Once we cross the Amazon tipping point, we trigger other tipping points around the world. It's like the first domino in a chain that spans the globe. The boreal forests of Canada and Russia would face increased fire pressure as global temperatures spike. These forests store enormous amounts of carbon too, and their collapse would accelerate warming even further. Arctic permafrost would melt faster, releasing methane and carbon dioxide that have been locked away for thousands of years. Ocean currents that regulate global climate would shift as massive amounts of fresh water from melting ice mix with salt water. The Gulf Stream, which keeps Europe warm, could weaken or even shut down entirely. Ironically, parts of Europe could face harsh cooling, even as the rest of the planet overheats. We'd be looking at what scientists call hothouse Earth, a planet where natural systems amplify warming instead of moderating it. Once we enter that state, human civilization as we know it becomes impossible to maintain. Food production would become unpredictable globally. International trade would collapse as every nation hoards whatever resources it has left. Technology and medicine would advance backward as societies focus entirely on short-term survival rather than long-term progress. The most heartbreaking loss would be irreversible. Those millions of species in the Amazon, the cures for diseases we haven't discovered, the evolutionary knowledge accumulated over millions of years, the indigenous wisdom about living in harmony with nature, gone forever. Future generations would inherit a broken planet and wonder how we could have been so blind to what we were destroying. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. This isn't inevitable. This nightmare scenario happens only if we lose about 8% more of the Amazon. 8%. That's roughly the size of Germany. It sounds like a lot, but at current deforestation rates, We could lose that much in just 15 to 20 years. We can continue on the current path and watch this catastrophe unfold, or we can recognize what we're really facing and act accordingly. Because once you understand what losing the Amazon actually means, not just for trees or animals, but for every human being on Earth, you realize we're not talking about an environmental issue anymore. We're talking about the survival of civilization itself. The Amazon isn't just the lungs of the Earth. It's the life support system for our entire planet. And right now, someone is standing next to that life support system with their finger hovering over the off switch. The question is, are we going to stop them in time? To understand how the Amazon's death would break our planet, we need to dive into the science behind this catastrophe. And I've got to warn you, the more you understand the mechanics of what we're facing, the more terrifying it becomes. Because the Amazon isn't just a forest that cleans our air and makes our weather. It's the keystone holding together a planetary system so complex that we're still discovering how it works. Let me start with something that's going to sound almost impossible to believe. The Amazon contains more living biomass than the rest of the world's forests combined. We're talking about roughly 500 billion tons of living matter. Trees, plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, everything alive. To put that in perspective, that's about 70 times the total weight of every human being on Earth. But here's what makes this truly mind-blowing. All that living mass is constantly processing the chemistry of our planet's atmosphere. Every second of every day, the Amazon is performing chemical reactions on a scale so massive that it affects the composition of air thousands of miles away. Think of the Amazon as Earth's largest chemical processing plant, except instead of making plastic or fuel, it's making our planet habitable. And unlike any factory humans have ever built, this one has been running continuously for 55 million years, constantly perfecting its processes, constantly adapting to changing conditions. Let's follow a single carbon atom to understand what the Amazon actually does. Right now, there's a carbon atom floating in the air above your head. Maybe it came from a car exhaust pipe yesterday, or maybe it was breathed out by someone on the other side of the world last week. That carbon atom is going to travel on wind currents for days or weeks until something captures it. If it's lucky, our carbon atom will end up in the Amazon, where it gets absorbed by a leaf during photosynthesis. That leaf uses the carbon to build more leaf tissue, or maybe to strengthen a branch, or perhaps to create a root that extends deeper into the soil. Our carbon atom becomes part of the tree, locked away safely, no longer floating free in the ends. Atmosphere, where it could trap heat and warm the planet. Now, here's the beautiful part. That tree will hold onto our carbon atom for decades, maybe even centuries. Some trees in the Amazon are over 1,000 years old, which means they contain carbon atoms that were floating in the atmosphere when Vikings were sailing to America. The Amazon has been quietly pulling carbon out of the air and storing it in trees since before human civilization began. Every year, the Amazon pulls about 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. That's roughly equal to the emissions from every car, truck, and airplane in the United States combined. Every single year. For 55 million years, the Amazon has been running the world's most effective carbon capture program. But here's where it gets really sophisticated. The Amazon doesn't just store carbon in trees, it stores carbon in soil, in roots, in fallen leaves, in the bodies of millions of species. The forest has created a multi-layered carbon storage system so complex that scientists are still mapping how it works. The soil alone contains about 40% of the Amazon's stored carbon. This isn't ordinary dirt, it's a living ecosystem of fungi, bacteria, insects, and decomposing organic matter that's been accumulating for millions of years. Some of this soil carbon is thousands of years old, locked away in chemical compounds so stable they've survived ice ages and natural disasters. When you walk through the Amazon, you're literally walking on top of one of the largest carbon storage facilities on Earth. Every step you take is on soil that contains more carbon than most countries emit in a year. But here's the terrifying part. When the Amazon dies, all that carefully stored carbon gets released back into the atmosphere, and it doesn't happen gradually over centuries. It happens in decades, or even years, depending on how the forest dies. If the Amazon burns, and large parts of it already are, burning every year, the stored carbon rockets into the atmosphere almost instantly. Those trees that took decades to grow and centuries to store carbon, they release all their carbon in a matter of hours as they burn. If the forest dies from drought and heat stress, which is happening in parts of the southern Amazon right now, the carbon release is slower, but still catastrophically fast. Dead trees decay, releasing their carbon as they rot. Soil organisms die off, and the soil carbon that took thousands of years to accumulate gets released as bacteria break down the dead organic matter. Either way, we're looking at the largest single release of carbon in human history. To understand the scale, imagine every coal plant on Earth running at maximum capacity for 20 years straight. That's roughly how much carbon the Amazon's death would release. Current atmospheric carbon dioxide levels are around 420 parts per million. The Amazon's death would add another 50 parts per million almost overnight. But here's what most people don't understand about atmospheric chemistry. The effects aren't linear. Adding 50 parts per million doesn't just make things a little bit warmer. It triggers a cascade of changes that amplify each other. More carbon dioxide in the atmosphere traps more heat. More heat melts more ice, which exposes more dark ocean water, which absorbs more heat instead of reflecting it back to space. More heat evaporates more water from the oceans, and water vapor is itself a greenhouse gas, trapping even more heat. Each change makes the next change bigger. It's like compound interest, but for catastrophe. And once these amplification cycles get started, they become incredibly difficult to stop. But carbon storage is only one part of what the Amazon does for our planet. The other part is even more complex and, in some ways, even more critical. Already, Amazon is Earth's most sophisticated weather control system. Let me walk you through how this works, because it's genuinely one of the most amazing things on our planet. The Amazon doesn't just respond to weather, it creates weather. It's a weather factory that's been running for millions of years, and it's so good at its job that it creates the exact conditions needed for its own survival. Every single day, Amazon trees release about 20 billion tons of water vapor into the atmosphere. 20 billion tons. That's more water than flows through the Amazon River, except it's floating invisible above the forest canopy. This water vapor rises into the atmosphere and forms clouds, which create rain, which falls back on the forest, which feeds the trees, which release more water vapor. It's a perfect cycle that's been running since before humans existed. But the Amazon's weather influence extends far beyond the forest itself. That water vapor gets caught up in global atmospheric circulation patterns and travels thousands of miles. Moisture that evaporates from a tree in the Brazilian Amazon might fall as rain in Argentina 2 weeks later. It might contribute to a thunderstorm in Texas a month later. The Amazon's weather influence spans continents. Scientists have tracked Amazon moisture all the way to the Arctic Circle. Water that evaporated from rainforest trees has been found in ice cores from Greenland. The Amazon isn't just a regional weather system. It's part of the global atmospheric circulation that controls weather patterns worldwide. When the Amazon dies, this massive weather engine simply stops. Those 20 billion tons of daily water vapor? Gone. The flying rivers that carry moisture across continents? They dry up instantly. Weather patterns that have been stable for thousands of years suddenly become chaotic. But here's what makes this even more terrifying. The Amazon's weather influence is so strong that losing it doesn't just change local weather, it shifts global atmospheric circulation patterns. The Earth's atmosphere is like a gigantic machine with moving parts that all depend on each other. The Amazon is one of the largest moving parts, so when it stops working, the whole machine starts operating differently. Jet streams shift, ocean currents change, storm patterns that have been predictable for centuries become unpredictable. Imagine if someone removed a crucial gear from the engine of your car while you were driving on the highway. The engine wouldn't just slow down, it would start running erratically, making strange noises, eventually shaking itself apart. That's what losing the Amazon would do to Earth's climate system. The monsoons that water crops feeding 3 billion people in Asia depend partly on atmospheric circulation patterns that start in the Amazon. The hurricane patterns that affect the Atlantic depend on temperature differences that the Amazon helps regulate. Even the Antarctic ice sheets respond to global atmospheric patterns that the Amazon influences. We're talking about breaking a planetary system that took millions of years to develop. And once it's broken, we don't know how to fix it. We don't even fully understand how it works. Here's another piece of the puzzle that's going to blow your mind. The Amazon doesn't just process carbon dioxide and water vapor. It processes chemicals that affect the entire planet's atmosphere. Trees in the Amazon release compounds called volatile organic compounds, ACA, essentially chemical messages that float through the air. Some of these compounds help form clouds by providing tiny particles for water vapor to condense around. Others break down pollutants in the atmosphere. Still others seem to influence weather patterns in ways we're just beginning to understand. The Amazon releases over 1,000 different chemical compounds into the atmosphere. 1,000. We've identified most of them, but we understand the function of only a small fraction. It's like trying to figure out how a computer works when you can see the flow of components, but don't understand the code. What we do know is that these atmospheric chemicals from the Amazon affect air quality and weather patterns across South America and beyond. When the Amazon dies, we lose not just the trees, but also this massive atmospheric chemistry lab that's been fine-tuning our planet's air composition for millions of years. But perhaps the most sophisticated thing the Amazon does is something most people have never heard of. It regulates its own climate through what scientists call biogenic cloud formation. Here's how it works. Amazon trees release specific chemicals into the atmosphere that help water vapor condense into clouds. More clouds mean more shade for the forest and more rain to keep the trees healthy. It's like the forest has learned to control its own weather by manipulating cloud formation. This isn't just accidentally helpful, it's an evolved system where the forest actively manages its environment for optimal growing conditions. The Amazon has essentially domesticated its own climate. When the Amazon dies, we lose this climate regulation system that took millions of years to evolve. The remaining forest fragments can't generate enough biogenic compounds to maintain cloud formation. Without clouds, the remaining trees get too much direct sunlight and not enough rain. They die faster, which means even fewer biogenic compounds, which means fewer clouds, which means more tree death. It's another one of those terrifying feedback loops where each loss accelerates the next loss. Now, let me paint you a picture of what this means for global climate stability. Earth's climate has been remarkably stable for the past 10,000 years, an entire period of human civilization. Temperatures have varied by only a degree or two. Weather patterns have been predictable enough for humans to develop agriculture, build cities, and create the complex societies we live in today. This stability isn't an accident, it's maintained by planetary systems that regulate themselves, systems like the Amazon. When these regulatory systems break, the stability breaks too. We're essentially performing an uncontrolled experiment on the only planet we have. We're removing crucial components from Earth's climate regulation system and hoping the rest of the system can compensate. But the science tells us it can't. The Amazon isn't just part of Earth's climate system, it's one of the main control mechanisms that keeps the whole system stable. Remove the Amazon, and we're not just looking at a hotter planet, we're looking at a chaotic planet, where weather becomes unpredictable, where the natural systems that support human civilization start breaking down. And here's the most chilling part. Once we break these systems, we don't know how to fix them. We can't rebuild the Amazon's weather control system. We can't recreate 55 million years of atmospheric chemistry evolution. We can't restart the biological and chemical cycles that took millions of years to develop. If we lose the Amazon, we're not just losing trees, we're losing the planetary life support system that makes human civilization possible, and we're running out of time to prevent it. The Amazon's death wouldn't kill us immediately. It would unravel civilization slowly, methodically, starting with something as simple as your morning coffee. Picture this. You wake up tomorrow and coffee costs $50 a cup. Not because of some economic crisis or trade war, but because the plants that produce 40% of the world's coffee have simply stopped growing. This is how the end begins, not with dramatic explosions or sudden collapse, but with the gradual breakdown of systems we take completely for granted. And coffee is just the beginning of a chain reaction that would touch every aspect of human life. Let me walk you through exactly how the dominoes fall, because understanding this cascade helps you realize why the Amazon isn't just an environmental issue, ABCC. It's a civilization issue. Brazil produces about 40% of the world's coffee, and coffee plants are incredibly finicky about rainfall patterns. They need exactly the right amount of rain at exactly the right times. Too little rain, and the plants stress and produce bitter beans. Too much rain at the wrong time, and the crops rot in the fields. The coffee regions of Brazil depend entirely on moisture from the Amazon to maintain these precise conditions. When the Amazon's flying rivers stop flowing, Brazilian coffee production doesn't just decline, too, it collapses completely. The rainfall patterns that coffee plants have adapted to over centuries suddenly disappear. Coffee plantations that have operated for generations become worthless almost overnight. But here's what makes this particularly cruel. Coffee doesn't just disappear gradually. Coffee plants take 3 to 5 years to mature, so when the current plants die from changed rainfall patterns, there's no quick replacement. The global coffee supply would shrink by 40% within 2 years, and stay that way for at least a decade. 2 billion people drink coffee daily. When 40% of the supply vanishes, prices don't just rise, they explode. Coffee becomes a luxury item like fine wine. Your daily coffee habit that costs you maybe $5 a day suddenly costs $50 a day. For most people, coffee simply disappears from their daily routine. Now, you might think, okay, so people drink tea instead. How bad can that be? But coffee isn't just a beverage, it's the foundation of massive economic systems. The global coffee industry employs over 25 million people, mostly in developing countries. When coffee production collapses, those 25 million people lose their livelihoods overnight. Coffee-producing regions in Brazil, Colombia, Vietnam, and dozens of other countries face immediate economic disaster. Entire communities that have built their lives around coffee cultivation suddenly have no income and no prospects. We're talking about massive internal migration as coffee workers abandon their homes to search for work elsewhere. But coffee is just the opening act. The real economic catastrophe begins with soybeans. Brazil is the world's largest soy producer, growing about 130 million tons annually. Argentina adds another 50 million tons. Together, they produce nearly half of the world's soybeans. And soybeans, unlike coffee, aren't just food for humans, they're the foundation of global protein production. 60% of soybeans go to animal feed. Those chicken nuggets you eat, the chickens were raised on soy. That hamburger, the cattle ate soy. The fish in your fish and chips, even farmed fish eat soy-based feed. Modern meat production is essentially a system for converting soybeans into animal protein. When Amazon moisture disappears, both Brazil and Argentina face immediate agricultural crisis. Soy plants are drought sensitive, and without the reliable rainfall patterns created by Amazon evaporation, soy production in both countries collapses within 2 growing seasons. The global implications are staggering. China imports 60% of its soybeans from Brazil and Argentina, about 100 million tons per year. When that supply vanishes, China faces an immediate protein crisis. The country that feeds 1/5 of humanity suddenly can't feed its livestock. Chinese meat production would collapse within months. Pork, which makes up 60% of meat consumption in China, would become unavailable to most consumers as pig farmers can't afford feed. Poultry production would follow immediately after. Fish farming, which provides crucial protein for millions of Chinese citizens, would scale back dramatically as fish feed becomes unaffordable. But the crisis wouldn't stay contained in China, as the world's second-largest economy scrambles to replace lost soy imports. Global soy prices would increase tenfold or more. Every country that imports soy would face the same choice: pay astronomical prices or watch their livestock industries collapse. The United States, Europe, Japan, South Korea, every developed economy would face immediate meat shortages as farmers couldn't afford to feed their animals. Meat would transform from an everyday protein source to an occasional luxury. The average American, who eats about 125 pounds of meat per year, would suddenly have access to maybe 20 pounds per year at affordable prices. This protein crisis would trigger social upheaval, unlike anything we've seen in modern times. Food riots would break out in cities across the developing world as billions of people suddenly can't afford their basic protein needs. Governments would face impossible choices between subsidizing food prices and maintaining other essential services. But the agricultural collapse would extend far beyond meat and coffee. The Amazon's moisture influences crop production across an area much larger than South America itself. Those flying rivers of water vapor carry Amazon moisture as far north as Mexico and as far south as northern Argentina. Corn production in Argentina, wheat production in Uruguay, rice production in southern Brazil, MSI, all depend on rainfall patterns that start with evaporation from Amazon trees. Argentina is the world's third largest soy exporter and a major wheat exporter. Uruguay exports significant amounts of rice and beef. Paraguay is a major soy and corn producer. When Amazon moisture disappears, the entire southern cone of South America faces agricultural disaster simultaneously. We're not talking about one country's crops failing. We're talking about the breadbasket of an entire continent turning into a dust bowl within a few years. The global food price explosion would make the 2008 food crisis look like a minor inconvenience. In 2008, food riots toppled governments in Haiti, Madagascar, and several other countries, when global food prices doubled. Now imagine food prices increasing 5 or 10 times over. We'd be looking at political collapse across the developing world. But here's where the story gets even more complex. The Amazon's influence on global weather extends far beyond South America. Those aerial rivers of moisture eventually reach the Himalayas, where they contribute to the Asian monsoon system that waters crops feeding 3 billion people. The monsoons are incredibly complex weather systems that depend on precise temperature and moisture differences between land and ocean. When the Amazon stops contributing moisture to global atmospheric circulation, it weakens the entire monsoon system across Asia. Rice production in India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Thailand would face immediate stress. These countries feed much of Asia, and rice is the primary food source for over half the world's population. A weakening of monsoon rains would reduce Asian rice production by 20 to 30% within a few years. China would face a double crisis: collapsing soy imports for livestock feed and reduced rice production for human consumption. India, already struggling to feed its massive population, would see crop yields decline just as global food prices explode. Bangladesh, one of the most densely populated countries on Earth, would face immediate food security threats. The human migration triggered by these agricultural collapses would dwarf anything in recorded history. The Syrian conflict, which displaced about 6 million people and strained European resources to breaking point, would look like a small local disruption compared to this. 30 million people live directly in the Amazon basin. When their home becomes the world's largest desert, they have to go somewhere. But where? Brazilian cities are already overcrowded. São Paulo, with 22 million people, couldn't absorb even a fraction of Amazon refugees without completely collapsing its infrastructure. But the Amazon refugees would be just the beginning. When agriculture collapses across southern South America, rural populations would migrate to cities en masse. When cities can't provide food or jobs for their existing populations, people would migrate internationally. We'd be looking at the largest human migration in history, irrespidi, potentially hundreds of millions of people forced to leave their homes due to agricultural collapse and climate change. And unlike previous migrations, which usually moved from poor regions to rich regions, this migration would happen when even rich countries are struggling with food shortages and economic crisis. The geopolitical implications would reshape the world order completely. Countries that have been food exporters for centuries would suddenly need to import food. Traditional trade relationships would collapse as every nation hoards whatever agricultural production it has left. Brazil, currently a major food exporter, would need to import massive amounts of food to feed its population. Argentina would transform from an agricultural powerhouse to a food-importing nation overnight. The economic implications are staggering. Countries would go from earning foreign currency through food exports to spending their reserves on emergency food imports. International conflict would become inevitable. When agricultural regions become uninhabitable, neighboring countries face impossible choices: accept millions of climate refugees and risk their own collapse, or militarize their borders and watch humanitarian catastrophe unfold. Water resources would become flashpoints for conflict. Rivers that cross international borders would face competing demands from desperate populations. The Rio Grande, already a source of tension between the United States and Mexico, would face unprecedented pressure as agricultural regions to the south collapse. But perhaps the cruelest irony would be medical. 25% of Western pharmaceuticals originate from rainforest plants, and 70% of plants known to be useful against cancer come from rainforests. The Amazon contains millions of plant species, most of which have never been tested for medicinal properties. In the Amazon's ashes, we'd lose cures for diseases we haven't even discovered yet. That child born with a rare genetic condition in 2050? The cure might have been in a flower that bloomed for the last time yesterday. The breakthrough Alzheimer's treatment that could save millions of minds? It might have been in a vine that died in a forest fire last week. Indigenous communities in the Amazon have developed sophisticated medical knowledge over thousands of years. They know which plants cure which diseases, how to prepare complex herbal remedies, how to treat conditions that modern medicine struggles with. When these communities are forced to abandon their homes, that medical knowledge disappears with them. We'd be looking at a reversal of medical progress just when we need it most. As global food shortages lead to malnutrition and weakened immune systems, as climate change spreads tropical diseases to new regions, as stress and displacement create mental health crises, we'd lose access to the natural pharmacy that could provide solutions. The technological response would be enormous but inadequate. Massive vertical farms would spring up in controlled environments, trying to replace the agricultural production lost to climate chaos. These facilities would be incredibly energy-intensive and expensive, requiring huge investments that struggling economies could barely afford. Carbon capture technology would scale up rapidly as governments desperately try to remove atmospheric carbon to stabilize the climate. But even the most optimistic projections for carbon capture technology show it would take decades to make a meaningful impact, and the costs would be astronomical. Trillions of dollars annually just to partially offset the Amazon's loss. Weather modification would become a massive industry. as countries try to recreate the rainfall patterns the Amazon used to provide for free. Cloud seeding, atmospheric manipulation, even space-based mirrors to regulate temperature would all be deployed. But these are crude tools compared to the elegant systems the Amazon provided naturally. The psychological impact on human society would be profound and lasting. Imagine growing up, knowing that your parents' generation destroyed the greatest wilderness on Earth and triggered the collapse of global food systems. The guilt and trauma would reshape human culture fundamentally. New forms of mental illness would emerge as people struggle to cope with living on a broken planet. Amazon syndrome would enter medical textbooks, a unique form of grief for a lost world. Depression and anxiety rates would skyrocket as people faced the reality of inheriting a degraded Earth. Religious and philosophical movements would emerge centered on mourning what was lost. Environmental pilgrimages to the ruins of the Amazon would become common as people try to connect with what was destroyed. Art, literature, and music would be dominated by themes of loss and regret. But perhaps most heartbreaking would be what happens to children. They would grow up in a world where animals exist mainly in zoos, where most food is artificially produced, where weather is chaotic and unpredictable. They would learn about rainforests and biodiversity the way we learn about dinosaurs, as fascinating creatures from a lost world. The Amazon's death wouldn't just change what we eat or where we live. It would change what it means to be human on Earth. We would become a species defined by the greatest catastrophe we ever caused, living forever with the knowledge that we destroyed the most magnificent biological system our planet ever created. And the cruelest part, all of this, every collapsed crop, every climate refugee, every lost cure, every broken system, could be prevented if we act now. But the window is closing fast, and once we cross the tipping point, all the wealth and technology in the world won't be able to put this system back together again. Let's take a journey 50 years into the future, to a world where the Amazon is gone. I want you to walk with me through this broken world, not because I enjoy apocalyptic scenarios, but because understanding what we could lose helps us understand what we're fighting to save. The year is 2075. You're flying over what used to be the Amazon rainforest, looking down at the largest desert on Earth. Where 6.5 million square kilometers of green wilderness once stood, you now see endless brown savanna spotted with the blackened stumps of ancient trees. The pilot mentions casually that the area below used to be rainforest, the way tour guides today point out the ruins of ancient civilizations. Children on this flight have never seen a living rainforest. They learn about jaguars and poison dart frogs the way we learn about dinosaurs, AGZ, creatures from a lost world that exist only in pictures and museum displays. When they ask their parents what the Amazon was like, the adults struggle to find words. How do you describe the sound of 1,000,000 birds at dawn to someone who's never heard it? How do you explain the feeling of standing beneath trees so tall they create their own weather to someone who's never experienced that cathedral-like silence? The maps in their geography classes show a massive brown stain where the rainforest used to be. Their textbooks include a chapter called The Great Dying that covers the period from 2025 to 2040 when the Amazon collapsed. But the numbers in those textbooks, 10 million species extinct, 300 billion tons of carbon released, hundreds of millions of climate refugees, are just statistics to these children. They can't comprehend what was lost because they never knew what was there. Cities like Manaus, once surrounded by forest and home to 2 million people, stand abandoned like modern ghost towns. Sand slowly buries the streets where tourists once walked to catch boats into the rainforest. The famous meeting of waters, where the Amazon and Rio Negro rivers flowed side by side without mixing, is now just another unremarkable muddy confluence. The rivers still flow, but they carry only water, none of the life that once made them magical. The few remaining indigenous communities have been forced to completely abandon their traditional ways of life. The Kayapo, the Yanomami, The hundreds of tribes who called the Amazon home for thousands of years, their cultures died with the forest. The shamans who knew which plants could cure which diseases, the hunters who could read the forest signs, the storytellers who carried the oral history of the rainforest, oh, one more. Their knowledge disappeared when the trees did. Some of these displaced indigenous peoples now live in urban refugee camps on the edges of cities like Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. They've become living museums, performing traditional dances for tourists who pay to hear about the world that was lost. The irony is bitter. The same people whose land was destroyed to create cattle ranches now entertain the descendants of those who destroyed their home. But perhaps the most heartbreaking sight in this future world would be the conservation areas, ITAs, tiny patches of forest preserved in artificial environments, like botanical zoos. Scientists have managed to keep alive perhaps 1% of the Amazon's original species in these controlled facilities. Visitors walk through climate-controlled domes that simulate rainforest conditions, looking at the last surviving specimens of what were once common species. These conservation centers are like libraries after a book burning, precious repositories of knowledge, but heartbreaking reminders of how much was lost. A single greenhouse might contain the last 100 individuals of a species that once numbered in the millions. Children press their faces against the glass, trying to imagine a world where such creatures roamed free across an area larger than Australia. Technology has rushed to fill the gap left by nature, but the substitutes are poor and astronomically expensive. Massive carbon capture facilities dot the landscape, industrial complexes the size of cities that work around the clock to do what trees once did for free. These facilities consume enormous amounts of energy and require constant maintenance. They can capture perhaps 10% of what the Amazon used to absorb annually, and they cost trillions of dollars to operate. Vertical farms have become crucial for food production in a world where traditional agriculture collapsed, along with stable weather patterns. These indoor growing facilities can produce food year-round in controlled conditions, but they require massive amounts of energy and can grow only a fraction of the crops that outdoor farming once provided. Food is abundant in these vertical farms, but it's expensive and lacks the nutritional complexity that came from crops grown in natural soil. The taste of natural food has become a luxury that most people have never experienced. Children who grow up eating vertically farmed produce don't know that tomatoes once had dozens of different flavors, or that wild fruits contain nutrients that laboratory-grown varieties can't replicate. The genetic diversity that once existed in wild crops is gone forever, replaced by a handful of varieties optimized for artificial growing conditions. Weather modification has become humanity's desperate attempt to restore the rainfall patterns the Amazon once provided. Massive installations shoot chemicals into the atmosphere to seed clouds, trying to create rain in regions that became deserts when the forest died. These efforts are partially successful. Some areas do get more rain than they would naturally, but the weather created is chaotic and unpredictable. Imagine living in a world where rain comes from machines instead of natural weather patterns. The rhythms that once governed agricultural seasons are gone, replaced by artificial precipitation schedules managed by government weather agencies. Farmers plant crops based on weather modification forecasts rather than natural seasons. Sometimes the machines work and crops thrive. Sometimes they don't, and entire regions face drought despite massive technological interventions. Cities have been forced to adapt to extreme weather that became normal after the Amazon's collapse. Sao Paulo, once a city of 22 million, is now protected by massive seawalls and storm barriers designed to handle the super hurricanes that became common when Atlantic weather patterns destabilized. Underground water reserves are guarded like nuclear weapons, with military installations protecting aquifers from desperate populations. The social structure of these cities reflects the new reality. The wealthy live in climate-controlled towers that provide filtered air, purified water, and artificial weather. The poor live in sweltering heat islands where temperatures regularly exceed what the human body can tolerate. Air conditioning isn't a luxury anymore. It's the difference between life and death during increasingly frequent heat waves. Architecture has been revolutionized by the need to survive in a world with chaotic weather. Buildings are designed to withstand hurricane-force winds, torrential flooding, and temperatures that would have been unimaginable 50 years earlier. Green rooftops aren't decorative anymore. They're essential for preventing buildings from overheating as urban temperatures soar beyond human comfort levels. The psychological landscape of this future world is perhaps the most disturbing aspect. Mental health statistics show that depression and anxiety rates tripled in the generation that witnessed the Amazon's collapse. A new category of mental illness emerged, planetary grief disorder, affecting people who can't cope with living on a degraded Earth. Suicide rates spiked among environmental scientists and indigenous peoples who watched the destruction happen despite their warnings. Many survivors report a persistent sense of guilt and helplessness. Support groups meet regularly in cities around the world, bringing together people who share the trauma of watching civilization's greatest environmental disaster unfold. Religious movements have emerged centered on mourning the lost world. The Church of the Vanished Forest holds services where congregants share memories of extinct animals and lost ecosystems. Environmental pilgrimage has become common, with people traveling to the ruins of the Amazon to grieve what was destroyed. These pilgrimages often take place in protective suits because the former rainforest region has become too hot and dry for human survival without life support. Children in this world exhibit psychological profiles unlike any generation before them. They show high rates of eco-anxiety and struggle with accepting a world that their elders broke. Many refuse to have children of their own, unable to justify bringing new life into such a damaged world. Birth rates have plummeted in developed countries as young people choose not to reproduce on a planet they see as doomed. Educational systems have been transformed to help children cope with planetary loss. Schools teach grief ecology alongside traditional subjects, helping students process the reality of living on a diminished Earth. Children learn meditation techniques to manage climate anxiety and participate in virtual reality experiences that let them visit the Amazon as it once existed. Art and culture in this future world are dominated by themes of loss and remembrance. Museums display artifacts from the Amazon, the way they once displayed objects from ancient civilizations. The last recordings of extinct bird songs are played in memorial concerts. Literature focuses on imagining what might have been if humanity had made different choices. Scientists work frantically to preserve what little remains of the biological knowledge that was lost. They study the DNA of extinct species, hoping to someday recreate them through genetic engineering. But even the most optimistic projections suggest that perhaps 1% of lost species could ever be brought back, and only in artificial environments that bear no resemblance to their original homes. The global economy has been fundamentally restructured around scarcity rather than abundance. Water rights have become more valuable than oil reserves ever were. Clean air is a commodity that the wealthy purchase while the poor breathe what remains of natural atmosphere. Carbon credits dominate international trade as countries desperately try to offset the emissions released when the Amazon burned. International relations are defined by resource competition and climate refugee movements. Traditional alliances collapsed when countries faced impossible choices between helping climate refugees and preserving resources for their own populations. New forms of eco-nationalism emerged as countries prioritized environmental survival over international cooperation. Border walls aren't built to keep out economic migrants anymore. They're built to keep out climate refugees fleeing uninhabitable regions. Immigration policy is based on carrying capacity calculations rather than humanitarian concerns. Countries that once welcomed immigrants now calculate precisely how many additional people their damaged ecosystems can support. The irony of this future world is that humanity has never been more technologically advanced, yet never more limited by environmental constraints. We can, to manipulate genes, modify weather, and grow food in space-age facilities, but we can't recreate the elegant systems that the Amazon provided for free. All our technology combined can't replicate the sophistication of a single rainforest ecosystem. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of this world is that the survivors know exactly what they lost. Unlike previous civilizations that collapse gradually, leaving their descendants to wonder what went wrong, the people of 2075 have detailed records of the Amazon's destruction. They know exactly which political decisions led to the tipping point. They know which companies prioritized short-term profits over planetary survival. They know which individuals could have made different choices but didn't. This knowledge creates a unique form of intergenerational trauma. Young people grow up studying the exact moment when their elders chose immediate economic gain over long-term survival. They read the speeches of politicians who knew about climate tipping points but acted as if they didn't exist. They watch recordings of protests by indigenous peoples who begged the world to save their home, while cattle ranchers bulldozed it anyway. The most heartbreaking sights in this future world are the memorial parks built where the most biodiverse parts of the Amazon once stood. These parks contain plaques listing the names of extinct species, not just the charismatic ones, like jaguars and macaws, but also the thousands of insects, plants, and fungi that disappeared when their habitat was destroyed. Visitors walk through these memorial parks, knowing that each plaque represents millions of years of evolution that ended during their parents' lifetime. And yet, even in this devastated world, life finds ways to continue. Humans adapt, as they always have. New technologies emerge, different relationships with nature develop. But it's adaptation to scarcity rather than abundance, survival rather than thriving. The people of this future world aren't monsters or failures. They're us, 50 years older, dealing with the consequences of choices made in our time. They're remarkably resilient, incredibly innovative, and heartbreakingly aware of what they've lost. They look back at our era not with hatred, but with profound sadness that we couldn't see what was coming in time to prevent it. But here's the thing that keeps me hopeful. This future isn't inevitable. Every detail I've described depends on decisions we make right now. The children learning about extinct jaguars in zoo museums don't have to exist. The memorial parks listing vanished species don't have to be built. The climate refugees fleeing dead forests don't have to flee. We still have time to choose a different story. But that window is closing fast, and the choices we make in the next few years will determine whether future generations thank us for our wisdom or mourn our blindness. The future I've shown you is possible, but it's not inevitable. That's the difference between a warning and a prophecy. Warnings can still be heeded. Here's the terrifying truth that keeps Amazon scientists awake at night. We don't need to imagine the apocalypse I've been describing because it's already beginning. Right now, as we're talking, the Amazon is dying. Not in some distant future, not hypothetically, but actually, measurably, irreversibly dying. And we're racing toward a tipping point that, once crossed, makes everything we've discussed inevitable. The Amazon has already lost 17% of its original forest coverage. 17%. That's an area larger than California, Texas, and Montana combined. Gone forever. But here's what makes this number so terrifying. Scientists have calculated that once the Amazon loses 25% of its original coverage, the remaining forest can't survive on its own. It literally can't generate enough rain to sustain itself. We're at 17%. We have 8% left. Before the point of no return, let me put this in perspective for you. At current deforestation rates, we'll hit that 25% threshold in 15 to 20 years. Your children will likely witness the moment when the Amazon crosses the line from recoverable ecosystem to inevitable collapse. Some scientists think we might have already passed the tipping point in parts of the southern Amazon. But here's what makes this even more chilling. The Amazon isn't dying from one cause. It's death by 1,000 cuts, and each cut makes all the others more deadly. Flying over the Amazon today, You can see the pattern of destruction spreading like a cancer through the forest. It starts with roads, thin lines cut through the green canopy to reach valuable timber or to access new areas for cattle ranching. These roads look harmless from above, like hairline cracks in green glass. But each road becomes a vector for forest destruction. Once a road exists, loggers follow it to cherry-pick the most valuable trees. They don't clear-cut everything, they just take the biggest, oldest trees that are worth the most money. This selective logging seems less destructive than total deforestation, but it's actually more insidious. It weakens the forest without killing it outright, making it vulnerable to fire, drought, and disease. After the loggers come the ranchers. They burn the remaining damaged forest to create pasture land for cattle. These fires often spread beyond the intended area, consuming healthy forest that was supposed to be preserved. Satellite images show massive burn scars spreading across the Amazon during dry season, areas of green forest turning brown and black as fire consumes decades of growth in hours. But here's the really terrifying part. These human impacts are accelerating natural processes that would normally take centuries. The Amazon is facing pressures it has never experienced in its 55 million year history, and it's facing them all, simultaneously. Climate change is making the Amazon hotter and drier. The temperature in the Amazon has increased by about 1 degree Celsius over the past 40 years, and rainfall patterns have become more erratic. This doesn't sound like much, but for an ecosystem that evolved in stable conditions, even small changes create enormous stress. The dry seasons are lasting longer and becoming more severe. Areas that used to receive regular rainfall now experience months without significant precipitation. Trees that evolved to expect consistent moisture are suddenly struggling to survive routine dry periods. Meanwhile, the wet seasons are becoming more intense and unpredictable. Instead of steady, gentle rains that the forest can absorb, the Amazon now experiences extreme flooding events that damage root systems and wash away topsoil. It's like the forest is being attacked from both directions. Too much water when it comes, not enough water most of the time. The feedback loops are what make this so dangerous. Here's how they work. When parts of the Amazon die or burn, less moisture gets evaporated into the atmosphere. Less moisture means less rain for the remaining forest. Less rain means more tree stress and death. More dead trees mean easier fires. More fires mean less forest. Less forest means even less rain. Around and around it goes, each cycle accelerating the destruction. Scientists studying these feedback loops have identified what they call fire-climate interactions that could trigger rapid Amazon collapse. Basically, once enough forest dies, the remaining areas become so dry that they burn spontaneously during normal dry seasons. We're not talking about human-caused fires anymore. We're talking about a forest that literally burns itself to death because it can no longer maintain the moisture levels needed for its own survival. This is already happening in parts of the southern Amazon. Flying over these regions, you can see areas that look more like African savanna than rainforest. Scattered trees dot grasslands where dense forest stood just 20 years ago. These areas crossed their own local tipping points and converted from rainforest to grassland permanently. The soil tells the story of this transformation. Rainforest soil is thin and nutrient-poor because most nutrients are stored in living plants rather than the ground. When the forest dies, there's nothing to hold this fragile soil together. It washes away during the intense rain events that now characterize the wet season, leaving behind hardpan that can't support tree growth even if someone tries to replant. Scientists have found that once rainforest converts to grassland, it doesn't come back naturally. Even if you stop all human activity in the area, even if you plant new trees, the changed soil and altered local climate patterns prevent forest regeneration. It's a one-way transformation that can't be reversed through natural processes. This is what scientists mean when they talk about the Amazon tipping point. It's not just that the forest dies, it's that it becomes incapable of regenerating. The Amazon transforms from a self-sustaining ecosystem into a self-destructing one. But the timeline for this collapse isn't gradual. Research published in recent years suggests that once the Amazon hits the tipping point, the remaining forest could die within 50 years. 50 years to lose an ecosystem that took 55 million years to develop. We're talking about biological collapse happening at historical speed. And here's the most chilling discovery. Different parts of the Amazon are approaching tipping points at different rates. The southern Amazon, which receives less rainfall and faces more human pressure, could cross its tipping point within the next decade. The eastern Amazon is following close behind. Even if we manage to save the northern and western parts of the forest, losing the southern and eastern regions would fundamentally alter the entire system. Think of it like losing major organs from a body. You might survive losing one kidney, but lose too many vital organs, and the whole system crashes. The Amazon's different regions depend on each other in ways we're still discovering. Lose the moisture-generating capacity of the southern Amazon, and you compromise the rainfall for the entire basin. The speed of change is what makes this crisis so dangerous. Natural ecosystems can adapt to gradual change over centuries or millennia, but the pressures facing the Amazon are happening over decades. Evolution can't keep up with human-caused environmental change. Species that took millions of years to adapt to rainforest conditions suddenly face savanna conditions within their lifetimes. Plants that evolved complex relationships with specific pollinators watch their partners go extinct before they can develop new pollination strategies. Animals that depend on fruit from particular trees find those trees dying faster than alternative food sources can be found. The indigenous communities that have lived in the Amazon for thousands of years are witnessing changes that violate everything their traditional knowledge tells them about how forests work. Elders describe weather patterns, animal behaviors, and plant cycles that their children have never experienced because the forest has changed so much within a single generation. These communities are living libraries of Amazon knowledge, and they're watching their world disappear in real time. When an indigenous shaman dies today, he might take with him knowledge of medicinal plants that no longer exist, understanding of animal behaviors that no longer occur, awareness of seasonal patterns that no longer happen. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of our current trajectory is how little time we have to change course. Environmental tipping points aren't like economic recessions, where you get warning signs and gradual declines. They're like stepping off a cliff. Everything seems stable right up until the moment you start falling. The Amazon might look healthy from satellite images today, but stress indicators show a system approaching collapse. Measurements of forest resilience, the ability to recover from disturbances like droughts or fires, show steady decline across large areas. The Amazon is losing its capacity to bounce back from normal environmental stresses. Scientists measure this through what they call early warning signals, statistical patterns that indicate when complex systems are approaching tipping points. These signals are lighting up across Amazon monitoring systems like warning lights on a failing machine. One key indicator is recovery time, how long it takes forest areas to return to normal after disturbances. Healthy forests recover quickly from droughts, fires, or other stresses. Forests approaching tipping points take longer and longer to recover from the same disturbances. Monitoring data shows Amazon recovery times increasing across the basin, suggesting the entire system is becoming more fragile. Another warning signal is increased variability in forest health measurements. Stable ecosystems show consistent patterns over time. Systems approaching collapse show more erratic patterns as they struggle to maintain stability. Amazon monitoring shows this increasing volatility in tree growth rates, species populations, and moisture cycles. Perhaps most concerning is what scientists call flickering, rapid switches between different states that indicate a system losing stability. Parts of the Amazon now switch unpredictably between forest and grassland conditions during drought years, suggesting these areas are balanced on the edge of transformation. All these warning signals indicate the same thing. The Amazon is approaching a critical threshold beyond which collapse becomes inevitable. And unlike gradual environmental changes that give societies time to adapt, tipping point events happen fast. The latest climate models suggest we might have even less time than previously thought. Rising global temperatures are accelerating Amazon stress faster than scientists expected. What looked like a 30-year timeline for reaching the tipping point now looks more like 15 to 20 years. Some models suggest certain regions could cross their individual tipping points within the next decade. This acceleration is partly due to what scientists call compound stress, multiple pressures hitting the Amazon simultaneously. It's not just deforestation anymore. It's deforestation, plus climate change, plus pollution, plus infrastructure development, plus mining, plus agriculture expansion, all happening at once. The Amazon is trying to cope with more pressure than any ecosystem can handle. And here's the kicker. These timelines assume we continue current trends. They don't account for potential acceleration of deforestation under political pressure or economic crisis. They don't factor in the possibility of mega fires that could destroy vast areas quickly. They don't consider the risk of disease outbreaks that could rapidly kill tree species across wide areas. In other words, our best-case scenarios for Amazon survival assume everything goes exactly as predicted with no additional catastrophes. But ecosystems under stress become more vulnerable to unexpected shocks, not less. The political situation adds another layer of urgency. The Amazon spans 9 countries, but Brazil contains about 60% of the forest. Brazilian politics around Amazon protection fluctuate dramatically with changes in government. Policies that protect the forest can be reversed quickly when political winds shift. We've seen this happen. Deforestation rates fell dramatically when Brazil strengthened forest protection in the early 2000s. But when political priorities changed, deforestation rates spiked again. The Amazon's fate depends partly on electoral outcomes in Brazil, which makes long-term protection incredibly difficult to guarantee. Meanwhile, global economic pressure for Amazon resources continues increasing. Growing global population means higher demand for beef, soy, and other products that drive deforestation. Rising commodity prices make forest destruction more profitable. Economic crises make short-term resource extraction more attractive than long-term conservation. The terrible arithmetic is simple. Current protection efforts are slowing Amazon destruction, but not stopping it. At best, we're buying time. But time for what? Unless something changes dramatically in how we approach Amazon conservation, we're just delaying inevitable collapse rather than preventing it. This is why climate scientists talk about the next decade as crucial for Amazon survival. Not the next century, not the next 50 years, and the next 10 years. The decisions made in the late 2020s will determine whether the Amazon survives as a functioning ecosystem or crosses the tipping point into irreversible collapse. And once we cross that line, all the money and technology in the world won't bring the Amazon back. We'll be living with the consequences of those decisions for the rest of human history. But here's what gives me hope. We're not there yet. 17% deforestation means 83% of the Amazon is still alive and functioning. That's still an enormous resilient ecosystem with incredible capacity for recovery if we give it the chance. The difference between 17% and 25% loss doesn't sound like much, but it's the difference between a system that can recover and a system doomed to collapse. We're in a race against time, but it's a race we can still win. The question is, will we? The war to save the Amazon is happening right now, and the heroes aren't who you'd expect. They're not politicians making speeches or environmental organizations posting on social media. They're indigenous communities using smartphones to monitor illegal logging in real time. They're former cattle ranchers who realize their children's future depends on keeping trees alive. They're young scientists using artificial intelligence to predict where deforestation will happen next. This is a different kind of environmental story than what you usually hear. Instead of focusing on doom and gloom, I want to show you the incredible, innovative, and sometimes surprising ways people are fighting to save the world's most important ecosystem. Because while the Amazon faces enormous threats, it also has extraordinary defenders. Let me start with the most effective forest protectors on Earth, indigenous communities who make up less than 1% of the global population, yet protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. In the Amazon, indigenous territories have the lowest deforestation rates of any land category, including national parks and protected areas. Take Chief Raoni Metuktir of the Kayapo people. At 90 years old, he spent his entire life defending an area of rainforest larger than Switzerland. His people have been fighting off loggers, miners, and ranchers for decades using traditional knowledge combined with modern technology. When I say fighting, I don't mean metaphorically. Kayapo warriors have physically confronted illegal invaders, sometimes at significant personal risk. But here's what makes their approach so sophisticated. The Kayapo don't just preserve forest, they actively manage it. They use controlled burns to create forest gardens that actually increase biodiversity. These controlled fires clear underbrush and create habitat patches that attract different species. Scientists studying Kayapo territories find more plant and animal diversity than in areas that are simply left alone. This traditional forest management is so effective that conservation organizations are now paying indigenous communities to expand their techniques. The Kayapo have developed systems for sustainable hunting, fishing, and plant harvesting that have kept their territories healthy for centuries. They're not just protecting the forest, they're showing the world how humans can live within forest ecosystems instead of destroying them. The technology revolution is transforming indigenous forest protection in ways that would have seemed like science fiction just 20 years ago. Indigenous communities now use satellite internet to coordinate between villages across vast distances. They have GPS devices to map illegal invasions with precision that can be used in court. They use drones to patrol territories that would take weeks to cover on foot. Most importantly, they now have smartphones with apps designed specifically for forest monitoring. When a community member spots illegal logging or mining, they can immediately photograph it, record GPS coordinates, and send evidence to authorities and environmental organizations worldwide. This real-time monitoring network covers millions of acres of Amazon territory. The app technology is remarkably sophisticated. Some apps can identify tree species from photos, calculate deforestation rates from satellite imagery, and even predict where illegal activity is likely to happen next, based on historical patterns. Indigenous users have become citizen scientists collecting data that helps protect their territories and inform global conservation efforts. But perhaps the most powerful tool indigenous communities have gained is proof. For decades, they reported illegal invasions that governments and media ignored or dismissed. Now they have irrefutable evidence, photographs, videos, GPS coordinates, timestamps. When Google Earth became available to indigenous communities, they finally had proof of illegal activities they'd been reporting for years. This documentation capability has transformed indigenous peoples from marginalized voices to credible witnesses in international forums. When a Kayapo leader shows satellite images of illegal mining in their territory to the United Nations, it carries weight that traditional oral testimony never could. The results are measurable. Indigenous territories in the Amazon have deforestation rates 5 to 10 times lower than surrounding areas. A recent study found that indigenous lands are more effective at preventing deforestation than national parks. The traditional knowledge that outsiders once dismissed as primitive turns out to be more effective than modern conservation techniques. But indigenous communities can't save the Amazon alone. They need allies, and some of those allies are coming from unexpected places. The technology sector is creating tools specifically for Amazon conservation that would have been impossible just a few years ago. Artificial intelligence systems can now analyze satellite imagery to detect deforestation within hours of it happening. These AI systems can distinguish between natural tree loss and human-caused clearing with remarkable accuracy. Microsoft's AI for Earth program has developed algorithms that can predict where deforestation is likely to happen next, based on patterns of road construction, commodity prices, and political developments. This predictive capability allows conservation organizations to position resources where they're most needed before destruction happens. Amazon Web Services, IA, yes, the company named after the river, has donated massive computing power to forest monitoring projects. Their cloud computing infrastructure processes satellite imagery from across the Amazon basin in real time, creating a digital nervous system that can detect forest threats faster than ever before. Google Earth Engine allows scientists and conservationists to analyze decades of satellite imagery to understand deforestation patterns and forest recovery rates. Researchers can now process environmental data that would have taken years to analyze using traditional methods. But the most exciting technological development might be environmental DNA monitoring. Scientists can now detect which species live in an area by analyzing water and soil samples for genetic material. This allows rapid biodiversity assessment of remote areas without the need for expensive and time-consuming species surveys. These eDNA techniques are being used to monitor the effectiveness of conservation efforts and to identify areas with high biodiversity that deserve protection. They're also being used to track illegal wildlife trade by detecting endangered species DNA in shipments that claim to contain only legal products. Drone technology has become incredibly sophisticated for forest monitoring. Modern conservation drones can fly for hours, capture high-resolution imagery, and even collect air samples to detect pollutants or signs of illegal burning. Some drones are equipped with acoustic sensors that can identify species by their calls, creating audio maps of forest biodiversity. The economic argument for saving the Amazon is becoming more powerful as we develop better ways to measure the forest's economic value. Economists have calculated that the standing Amazon is worth $8.2 billion annually to Brazil in ecosystem services alone, PCA, water regulation, carbon storage, biodiversity conservation, and climate regulation. This calculation doesn't include the value of potential medical discoveries, the economic benefits of ecotourism, or the global climate regulation services the Amazon provides. When you factor in all the economic benefits, preserving the Amazon is far more profitable than destroying it. Carbon credit markets are beginning to make forest preservation financially competitive, with cattle ranching and agriculture. Under current carbon pricing systems, landowners can earn more money keeping forest standing than they can by converting it to pasture. As carbon prices rise, with increasing global climate action, this economic incentive will become even stronger. Brazil nut harvesting, acai collection, rubber tapping, and other sustainable forest products provide more long-term income than cattle ranching in many areas. These forest products don't require destroying the ecosystem, MAR. They depend on keeping it healthy. Communities that switch from extractive industries to sustainable forest management often find they earn more money while preserving their environment. Ecotourism is becoming a major economic force for Amazon conservation. Tourists pay premium prices to visit pristine rainforest areas, providing income for local communities that exceeds what they could earn from logging or ranching. A single tree that might be worth $50 if cut down could generate thousands of dollars in tourism revenue over its lifetime. The solutions exist for regenerating damaged Amazon areas, and they're more effective than many people realize. Costa Rica proved that forest restoration is possible on a large scale, bringing back rainforests that were 90% destroyed. Their success story shows that even severely degraded areas can recover if given proper protection and restoration support. In the Amazon, restoration projects are using a combination of natural regeneration and assisted regeneration techniques. Natural regeneration involves simply protecting damaged areas and allowing them to recover on their own. This works surprisingly well in areas where the soil hasn't been completely destroyed and seed sources are available nearby. Assisted regeneration involves more active intervention, ADF, planting native species, controlling invasive plants, restoring soil nutrients, and managing water flow. These techniques can accelerate forest recovery dramatically, turning damaged pastureland back into forest within decades instead of centuries. The key insight from successful restoration projects is that you don't need to replant every tree. Forest ecosystems are remarkably good at healing themselves if you remove the sources of damage and provide a little help getting started. Pioneer species colonize damaged areas naturally, creating conditions for other species to follow. One of the most promising developments is the involvement of former cattle ranchers in forest restoration. As cattle ranching becomes less profitable due to international pressure and changing markets, some ranchers are switching to forest restoration and sustainable forest management. These converted ranchers bring valuable skills to conservation. They know the land, they understand local economics, and they have the political connections to make change happen. When a former cattle rancher becomes a forest restorer, it sends a powerful message to other landowners that conservation can be economically viable. Some of these restoration programs are explicitly designed to provide economic incentives for landowners to restore forest rather than maintain pasture. Payments for ecosystem services, carbon credit programs, and sustainable forest product markets make restoration financially attractive. Young people worldwide are becoming increasingly engaged in Amazon conservation, and their involvement is changing the nature of the movement. The generation that grew up with climate change as a constant concern understands that their future depends on protecting ecosystems like the Amazon. School climate strikes have specifically highlighted Amazon destruction as a global emergency. Student activists in Europe and North America organize protests outside Brazilian embassies when deforestation rates spike. Young people are making Amazon conservation a major political issue in countries far from South America. University students are developing innovative technologies for forest monitoring and restoration. Engineering students create drone systems for conservation. Computer science students develop apps for indigenous forest monitoring. Biology students participate in research projects that improve our understanding of Amazon ecology. This youth engagement is creating political pressure for Amazon protection in ways that traditional environmental lobbying never could. When young people vote based on environmental issues, politicians take notice. When students refuse to buy products linked to Amazon destruction, companies change their supply chains. Corporate involvement in Amazon conservation is increasing rapidly as companies face consumer pressure and supply chain risks related to deforestation. Major food companies have made commitments to eliminate deforestation from their supply chains, creating market incentives for sustainable agriculture. Some companies are going beyond simply avoiding deforestation to actively supporting reforestation. Technology companies are funding satellite monitoring systems. Food companies are investing in sustainable agriculture techniques that increase productivity without requiring new land clearing. The fashion industry is developing alternatives to leather that don't require cattle ranching. The food industry is creating plant-based proteins that reduce demand for soy-fed livestock. These market-driven changes reduce the economic pressure for Amazon deforestation. Perhaps most importantly, financial institutions are beginning to treat deforestation as an investment risk. Banks are refusing loans for projects linked to Amazon destruction. Insurance companies are declining coverage for activities that contribute to deforestation. Investment funds are divesting from companies with poor environmental records. This financial pressure is remarkably effective because it makes Amazon destruction economically unviable. When you can't get loans or insurance for deforestation-linked projects, those projects simply don't happen. International cooperation on Amazon conservation is improving, though slowly. The Amazon spans 9 countries, and effective protection requires coordination between all of them. Regional agreements are beginning to create unified approaches to conservation that cross national borders. Brazil contains about 60% of the Amazon, but what happens in Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, and other Amazon countries also affects the entire ecosystem. Deforestation in one country can disrupt rainfall patterns for neighboring countries, creating incentives for regional cooperation. International funding for Amazon conservation is increasing through programs like the Amazon Fund and various UN initiatives. These programs provide financial resources for conservation activities while respecting national sovereignty over natural resources. The most hopeful development might be the growing recognition that Amazon conservation is a global security issue, not just an environmental issue. When world leaders understand that Amazon collapse would destabilize global food systems and trigger massive climate refugee movements, forest protection becomes a national security priority. Military and intelligence agencies are beginning to classify environmental threats like Amazon deforestation as security risks that require coordinated response. This security framing provides political support for conservation programs that environmental arguments alone couldn't generate. The battle for the Amazon is being fought on multiple fronts simultaneously: technological, economic, political, cultural, and legal. No single approach will save the forest, but the combination of all these efforts creates hope that we can prevent catastrophic collapse. The most encouraging aspect of this battle is how many different types of people are involved. Indigenous communities, scientists, tech entrepreneurs, former ranchers, young activists, corporate executives, and government officials are all working toward the same goal through different methods. This diversity of approaches and participants makes the conservation movement more resilient and more likely to succeed. When indigenous traditional knowledge combines with artificial intelligence, when former cattle ranchers become forest restorers, when young activists pressure corporations to change their supply chains, you start to see the kind of systemic change that could actually save the Amazon. We have the knowledge, technology, and resources needed to prevent Amazon collapse. What we need now is the political will to implement solutions at the scale and speed required. The next decade will determine whether all these conservation efforts succeed in time to prevent the tipping point, or whether they'll be remembered as heroic but insufficient efforts to save an ecosystem that we understood too late. The battle for the Amazon's future is the battle for our future. And despite all the threats and challenges, there are more reasons for hope today than there have been in decades. The question is whether hope will translate into action fast enough to save the world's most important forest.